Welcome to another episode of Everyday to Exotic. Join us as we share some of the unique vehicles in our diverse collection of exotic and everyday cars.
Driving each car provides a different experience, each with their individual strengths and weaknesses.
We'll take you through those characteristics together, both up close in the studio and while driving them on the beautiful roads of Oregon.
Finally, we'll individually award points for each episode's car to determine where it ranks in the Haugland Collection.
Oh, what's the line?
It's,
Line!
We're glad you're here for this episode of...
Okay. Ready?
Ready, and the camera, both of you, action.
Ooh, yeah, you see, I'm only superhuman. Levitate and go into the moon, man. Blast off, yeah. You see my true plan, spreading joy, feeling new, yeah. Keep it moving, blast off.
The Ferrari 308 GTB and Targa-topped GTS were the first 8-cylinder Ferraris to wear the prancing horse and the official Ferrari name.
Initially, Enzo Ferrari was reluctant to devalue the brand by offering anything less than a 12-cylinder engine, having relegated the few V6s and V8s built before then to be sold under the Dino name.
As a result, the 308 GTB replaced the Dino 246 GT. Introduced in 1976, its mix of high-performance, exotic design, prestige branding, and comparable affordability made it Ferrari's most successful model introduced at the time, and it is still one of the best-selling Ferraris in the history of the brand.
Playing a starring role in Magnum P.I. alongside Tom Selleck also helped push the popularity of the car.
Ferrari.
For us, this was the first Ferrari to join the Haugland Collection. It was bought locally and had been regularly driven and mechanically maintained, but it needed a lot of cosmetic restoration to get to where it is today.
Watch me get it live. Number one. Baby, number one. Number one. A 1, a 2, a 3. Watch me get it live.
So, one of the things that really attracted us to this car when I first saw it is the color. I'm kind of tired of every Ferrari having to be red with a tan interior, but that was really the standard in the 1980s especially. To me, the gunmetal gray is absolutely perfect. It really emphasizes the lines of the car, gives beautiful reflections, gives it a shape that really stands out, but at the same time doesn't look like absolutely every other Ferrari 308 out there.
Another visual advantage of the gunmetal gray as opposed to the typical Ferrari red is that it emphasizes the lines and the creases of the shape of the car.
Yeah, the Ferrari red has a tendency to make that really kind of fade out into the sameness.
Here on the side of the car, these vents allow air to go into the engine and cool the engine. They don't just look cool. And the other cool feature about this side of the car is that the door handles are just these little things, and unlike every other door handle, they're vertical. That can be in an outtake. Amy trying to close the Ferrari door.
So one of the things you'll notice on this car is that the front bumper doesn't really match the back. This front bumper is actually the European style bumper, which is a nice, light, elegant piece that provides no protection whatsoever. In the US, they had to have 5-mile-an-hour impact bumpers. There were these giant, heavy things that stuck out. We went ahead and fixed it, but when we did it, we decided to go back to the European style bumper rather than trying to source the heavy, obnoxious American one. One other detail I really like in the design is the cutout in the front cover for the wiper arms that basically follows the shape. The downside is you cannot lift it from this corner or it will bend, so you pretty much have to lift from further forward.
Another cool detail, of course, is pop-up headlights. Very popular at this time. One of the aesthetically pleasing things for me about that is that when they're not on, they just fade into the gorgeous angle of the front. Another thing you'll notice is this huge chin spoiler. It's great for air resistance, but you need to be really careful going in and out of driveways. If you don't come in at the right angle, you will scrape.
Another thing that I really like about the car is that it has a bunch of vents. For the most part, it's not just because they're cool, but because they actually serve a function. So we've got our radiator grille tucked down at the very bottom here, underneath the nose of the car, so it almost fades out of view from most angles. The vents on the top here, however, let all of that heat from the radiator back out of the car so that you actually have an effective cooling system. Without that, what would happen is all the air would come in, pile up in the front, and never escape, and therefore it wouldn't actually cool.
So there's also these vents on the side. The one on the other side is purely aesthetic. This one, however, has a purpose. Covers your gas cap. And as another luxury feature, you have this rubber piece to keep the gas nozzle from scraping your paint.
The only other vents on the car are these here, which let air out of the engine bay. The engine sits basically here. This section is pretty much reserved to be your trunk.
This is a mid-engined car. These flying buttresses were very common for mid-engined cars of that era, but it leads to this tiny little rear window. It adds strength that the mid-engine car needs structurally, but it definitely detracts from your visibility.
Very, very early cars were all made with a fiberglass body. Shortly into 1977, they had switched entirely away from that to these steel-bodied cars. This is actually a very early steel-bodied car, built in 1976, but it is in the range when they were still building the fiberglass cars. Whether that was exclusively for the US market that they switched to steel first, this at least is a steel-bodied car.
I think I might have won the lotto. I think you're cooler than gelato. You're the hottest on the market, and you're only getting started.
So the engine and trunk are all under one single giant cover. In order to access it, you actually have to pull a lever in the driver's side door jamb. Amy, will you do the honors?
There you go.
This car's been modified with shocks. Originally, it actually had a center prop. They later on went to shocks because that center prop is in your way no matter what you do in the engine bay. Your trunk is actually here under this fabric cover that you unzip and holds maybe about 3 cases of wine. The downside of this is your muffler sits directly below it, your exhaust runs right next to it, everything is all around it, and you've got a giant V8 sitting right back here. There's some insulation between the trunk and that, but I wouldn't use this car to go shopping for ice cream. The engine itself is a quad-cam V8, 2,927 cc's, so not really quite 3 liters. It revs to 7,200 RPM, so pretty high for a V8. We've got 2 distributors, one in the back and one up here, each connected to an independent coil, and that provides our ignition, basically each one running 4 cylinders. It has 4 downdraft Weber carburetors. There's 2 here, 2 more back on that side. Very early cars were carbureted. Later ones, they went to fuel injection. The fuel injected cars actually had less power than the carbureted cars, as it turned out, largely due to emissions. Later on, however, they went to a 4-valve per cylinder configuration, which allowed them to basically get the power back up to where it was on the early carbureted cars. Of course, when you start getting into things where you start having multiple carburetors, they all have to be synced and balanced so that they all run together essentially and give the same amount of fuel and same amount of air at the same time. So that means you usually end up with fairly complicated throttle linkage, a lot of adjustments in order to be able to make it work. You'll also notice that there's one component here that doesn't have a belt on. That's the air pump, which originally is part of the emission system, and on these cars tends to freeze up over time. So as you can see, I cannot even turn this by hand. Easiest thing is take the belt off. So power is fed through a 5-speed transaxle with a limited slip to the rear wheels. It sits on a chassis all made out of steel tubing. The majority of the underlying structure of this car is just basically a steel tube chassis that Ferrari developed. They used the same chassis whether the car was a GTB with a hardtop or a GTS with a removable targa. So the suspension, which you can kind of see here with the shocks, is done via coil-over tube shocks and has unequal length wishbones front and rear. So it's fully independent suspension, very nice, compliant, works very, very well. And you can see some of the framing of the body in the steel tubes as you look in the engine bay. So, of course, Ferrari doesn't want you to not realize that it's a Ferrari engine. So we've got Ferrari here, we've got Ferrari down here. I mean, those are the same cast piece. Why put it on twice? Because you might not see it in the first place. Although the engine's in the back, we still have a front compartment here. It's not really a trunk, thinking about it. If we go ahead and pop it open, thank you, Amy. We come up and we see very little, to be honest. What you primarily see is this cover, which has a little aluminum plate underneath it. And what it does, mostly, is cover up the spare tire, which hides under here. Underneath the spare tire is your battery. So of course, to do anything with the battery, you have to pull this thing out, which is kind of a pain. Here you've got your brake fluid and your clutch reservoirs. Up front, you have your radiator with its fans and everything. And then you also have your windshield washer bag, which basically is same thing as a bottle in every other car. So really, the entire front of this car is taken up pretty much exclusively by mechanical bits. Nothing as far as storage is really up here that you can really do anything with. Everything is in that small space in the back.
You're my favorite, hands down, don't gotta explain it. 5 stars, #1, looking famous. Yeah, you're my favorite.
Welcome to the interior. The Ferrari 308 went through several iterations of interior style. This is one of the earliest. This interior is not original. When we got this particular Ferrari, it had the original interior in it. It was black, which is fine, but it was also worn and had some tears in it, and it really needed to be redone. We decided at that point that we preferred red interiors. It still has the really cool, leather and vinyl details and all of those things. Red interior means that the car gets a little less hot inside, and it's already a fairly dark car on the outside. It brightens it up a little bit. One of the things that I love is the prancing pony is absolutely freaking everywhere. You've got it in your usual place on the steering wheel. You've got it embossed into the back of the seat. You've got it on both of the levers that open the front and the back. It's here, it's on the shift knob, it's absolutely everywhere. You are under no circumstances going to forget that you are in a Ferrari. All the gauges pretty much are here in front of the driver. It's very easy to keep track of those. There's just a couple that are tucked under the cowling here for some reason, but you don't need to pay attention to those. Out of sight, out of mind. Here in the center console, you have a whole bunch of your fabulous, I love the toggle switches and the actual buttons and dials and everything, including your air conditioning, which is improved. There's your choke, aerial. You can really feel when you do stuff. The handbrake, as far as we can tell, is here for aesthetic purposes. You can engage it, but it doesn't appear to do anything. It only holds you in place on flat ground, which gravity does anyway. It's much easier to just make sure it's in gear. The steering column has no adjustment. None. Ferrari put it where they wanted it, and if you want to adjust it, buy a Porsche.
Yeah. That's so good.
The radio is mounted in the dash. This is not the original radio. This car originally came with a fitted tape deck that was super, super expensive. And it had a dictaphone in it with a handheld microphone. So you could talk about your very important Ferrari thoughts as you were driving down the road. It didn't work right when we got the car, so we took it out and replaced it with a fairly conventional radio. It's got a little switch here to make the aerial go up and down, which is, that's cool. It was a cool thing at the time. This car has no glove box. It just has these very deep door pockets for you to put your random stuff in. The door handles on the interior are very subtle, as in you can't see them. If you don't know where they are, you can get stuck in this car. In order to activate the super cool headlights, you just twist this little knob, twist it back down. The one thing to be careful about with that is it's very, very easy to twist that knob. And if you are going for your turn signal and you miss, you may accidentally turn your headlights on instead.
On the back half of the weekend, when the living room light pours in, I can almost slow down my breathing before the work starts again. Before it starts again.
Right now we're driving south of our home base in Eugene. It's really some of the most beautiful roads in the state in a lot of ways. Just you're in the southern end of the Willamette Valley. There's a fair number of vineyards out here, a lot of forest, a lot of nice farmland, pasture, and just great winding roads going through the hills. I mean, if I were to say that there's a downside in Oregon, is that there really is a driving season. Though it's really nice having days like this. As we get deeper into winter, it tends to get pretty rainy. So that sort of usually spells the end of the season. But if a day like this pops up again, take advantage of it while we can.
Calm yourself down. Why don't you take a minute? Let the air go in and out.
So in a lot of ways, this car is really ideal for driving on country roads. It's a little bit of a pain in town. It's got a kind of a heavy clutch and things like that. But once you get moving, it's actually not too bad. And the faster you go, the smoother it seems to drive. It quarters beautifully. It handles great, fantastic acceleration. And the suspension's actually really nice. I mean, the road I'm driving on is a fairly old country road in a lot of ways. You feel the bumps and things from the suspension, but it doesn't really jar you at all.
No, it's a pretty smooth ride. I mean, one of the other things I like about this car is it has luxury features like a heater.
And air conditioning.
It has a nice radio. So if, regardless of the weather, unless it's, snowing, at which point you really don't want to drive anywhere you don't have to anyway, it's a really nice all-season car.
If I were to say that there's a downside, I think the biggest downside is that it's pretty loud in here. And that's a problem with most mid-engine cars, to be honest.
The engine's closer to you than it would be in either a rear-engined or a front-engine car.
Yeah, I'm driving around with a large V8 stuck right behind my ears and hearing a lot of the sound from the engine itself. I mean, for a lot of these mid-engine cars, there's always some compromises in seating position and things like that. This one's not too bad. The seats are relatively comfortable. I have to lean it a fair amount back to not have my hair and head touching the ceiling at 6 feet tall.
That is something I notice about a lot of sports cars, is that the seats do tend to be sort of reclined back. I find myself sitting far more forward in order to, see over the steering wheel.
Well, and at the same point, the steering column on this has no adjustment whatsoever, so it cannot move in or out.
Again, there are compromises if you want to drive a sports car. Or at least if you want to drive a Ferrari.
Yeah. These are probably actually some of the best Ferraris to actually own of this generation, though, because maintenance isn't that difficult. Parts availability is great.
Of course, parts are still expensive because they say Ferrari on them.
Of course. But these are also pretty reliable engines.
True.
They're not as high-strung as some of the Ferrari engines. Our front-engine, rear-wheel drive Ferraris that we have in the collection, pretty much all of them are just beautiful, comfortable cars to drive in a long time. And, I mean, you and I have taken this over to Bend and things like that.
Oh,
We've
yeah,
done
yeah.
2.5, 3 hour drives in it without any real issues. But would I drive it all the time? Probably not.
I take the back gate to the garden. There's the waste I've been.
So, I enjoy driving this car. The clutch is a little bit heavy, so again, in town, it's not anywhere near as much fun. Once you're cruising, though, this is really lovely drive.
Spend an hour with the sunshine on my mind. Universe spin.
It handles beautifully. You don't feel like it's going to run away with you, which was not what I was expecting, honestly, when I first was driving a Ferrari because I was like, it's a Ferrari, it's a sports car, it's, you know, fast, and it's gonna wanna jump out of my hands. It's really not like that. And part of that, I feel like, is in reality with a race car especially, you don't want something that's gonna get out of control at speed. Not that we are racing at all or speeding in this car, because we're not. But my expectations in that case were not super realistic.
I mean, it's capable of going fast.
Oh yes, absolutely. But I love how I just have to turn the steering wheel just a tiny bit, and it hugs the curves. It's just drive this car on freeways and things like these back roads. Just stuff where I don't have to stop and go a lot.
I mean, that said, this is a 308 GTB. The B stands for Berlina, which means that we've got a fixed roof, as opposed to GTS, which was a Spider that had a removable roof section. But the GT is Grand Touring, so they intended this car to be sort of a long-distance driver.
Yep. Again, even on these curves, the Ferrari really doesn't have any problems. It just holds on, and you don't have to go crazy with the steering.
Yeah, the steering's actually pretty responsive. A little bit of a turn gets you quite a ways.
And then you just hold it.
Yep.
I feel like with this car, I have to sort of mold myself to the car rather than the car fitting me.
I can see that, and I think that's kind of typical of Ferrari to some extent. Right, after a very lovely drive, we are now back in the studio, and it's time for the Haugland Score. Here's how it works.
Alex and I have individually rated the car in 5 categories, each with a rank of 0 to 10. Then we add our scores together to give us the final Haugland score.
After we combine our scores, the results go up on the board. So first category is performance. For this, I gave it an 8. Really, from a sports car point of view, it's kind of everything you're looking for in many ways. Not necessarily the fastest, not necessarily the best at everything, but for a car of its era, it's actually a pretty decent one.
And I gave it the same score. I also gave it an 8 for similar reasons. I loved how responsive it was, how well it reacted, and it wasn't jerky. It was a very, honestly, fairly relaxed drive. All right, for styling, I gave it a 7. I do like the lines. I love all the little details. It's just generally a very nice looking car.
That's very entertaining because I also gave it a 7. We're obviously thinking on sort of the same wavelength here. I like a lot of the details about it. It really does have a good shape. It is almost the epitome of what a Ferrari was at this time.
So for drivability, I gave it a 6. The clutch is kind of heavy for in-town driving. There's no trunk really to speak of. I'd have a hard time figuring out where to park it. It is a lovely car, it's a lovely drive, but I would not use it for everyday tasks.
So I actually gave it a 4, weirdly for almost the same reasons in many ways. I mean, it has a trunk, but you have to open up the engine compartment, unzip the flap to get into the trunk. It's tricky for us to basically load up suitcases and go on even a weekend trip in it. It has a lot of annoyances. It makes it a great car to go out and tour in, but not necessarily something I would driving every day. So as far as significance, I actually gave this a 6. It's a significant car in a lot of ways for Ferrari because it was the first Ferrari to have a V8 engine that actually had a Ferrari badge on it. And so it was a good entry-level car that more people could afford. I mean, I wouldn't have ever called it affordable, but compared to the other V12 Ferraris, the big Ferraris, it was a much more affordable, usable car. So for Ferrari, it's a pretty significant car. For me, a little bit less so. It's not the kind of car I tend to look at driving and owning in the collection. As far as Ferraris, I love front-engine V12 rear-wheel drive touring cars. This is a little bit too much of the sports car end of the Ferrari for me.
Now I gave it a 7 for similar reasons. So it was the first one we added to our collection. So it's sort of significant that way. And it's the first Ferrari in its build year that had a steel body. So for delight, I gave it a 7. We do get a lot of interaction when we're out and about, a lot of thumbs up, but it just doesn't spark the same joy that some of our other cars do.
I also gave it a 7. In a lot of ways, It draws a lot of interest, but a lot of it's frankly kids who love the fact that it's a Ferrari, not caring anything else about the car. And I think a lot of people tend to look at it sort of that same way. It's not a, hey, that's something special. It tends to have positives and negatives associated with it.
All right, after some calculation, our final score is 67 for our 1976 Ferrari 308 GTB.
So in a lot of ways, even though this is a Ferrari, this is an entry-level car for the Ferrari brand at the time. It's not necessarily their best, it's not their fastest, but it is actually a pretty decent car. They're reliable, they run well. It's a pretty good score for a pretty good car.
It's like, what was it, Luigi?
Well,
Better than a Ferrari?
no.
Nope.
Luigi follow on with the Ferraris.
Thank you for watching this episode of Everyday to Exotic.
Our goal is to create a show that's as much fun for you to watch as it is for us to make.
So please comment. Let us know what you liked and what you'd like to see.
Don't forget to subscribe. We're creating new content all the time, and we're looking forward to bringing it to you. You'll want to be among the first to know.
And if you have friends who you think would enjoy this, please go ahead and share it with them.
Don't forget to like.
And if you want to see what else is going on with the Haugland Collection, follow us on Instagram at Haugland Collection. We'll see you on the next episode of Everyday to Exotic.
Okay, see you later. Bye.